Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much to the Volkswagen Foundation for inviting me and for the support of the Robert Bosch Foundation, also for this initiative, Open Society, that has something to do with this first session here. Maybe we can come back to this in the discussion. And thank you very much, Gerd Scobel, for the introduction. I have not a real comment on every aspect of Naomi's talk that was presented already, but more something like an addition in the broader context of this conference here. But I can start with the last thing that was mentioned, this William James thing, that truth is a process. And if you say something like truth is a process and knowledge is only preliminary and there will be other knowledge that will come into place soon and things like that, and if you have something like counterintuitive evidence and things like that, this is of course something that ordinary people have problems to understand, because the ordinary everyday concept of truth is totally opposite. There is something where you see by face validity, by intuition, this is this and that is this and that is fine. And this is not preliminary, this is not something like counterintuitive, and this is not processual. So a threat or a challenge for science, especially today, is of course a difference between what scientists understand as truth and what everyday people in everyday life understand as truth. And this is especially a problem if we have a huge tendency in parts of academic work, and this was already mentioned by Gerd Scobel and also by Naomi Oreskes, that there is this famous constructivism. I mean, there was a very good essay a few months ago after the election of Trump by Michael Hampe, who said, okay, we had all this kulturwissenschaftliche constructivism. Why should we be surprised that we now have politicians who would argue on the level of pure constructivism? Just saying reality is not there, reality can be manufactured just by some constructive modes. So there's something like an inner development, an inside development within science that may be problematic in terms of their authority or of their societal importance. So this is one thing. This is more an inherent problem, and Naomi said many things to these scientifically inherent problems. But in times where the political frame starts to change, because totalitarian, authoritarian politicians are not interested in scientific truth, but they are interested in shaping a certain type of society that is very much different from a liberal democratic society, then there is, of course, a challenge of these traditional, conventional, and very sophisticated scientific concepts, and it might be very easy for politicians like Trump or Viktor Orban or others to use these inherent problems and criticisms and preliminary knowledge and things like that to devalue scientific knowledge and to put alternative facts against it. And the other thing is that knowledge in a scientific sense is of course challenged by all these direct media things, where one quality of the information committed by these direct media is that it's completely unclear where this knowledge comes from. And the strongest aspect of scientific knowledge is that it's based on standard and methods, but people don't know that it is based on standards and methods. So for many people, each type of knowledge is as good as another type of knowledge. So this is also something that might be a challenge. And the third thing, I think, is that scientists, that researchers are not something like they have been in terms of prominent figures like heroes of progress and things like that. So think of science in the beginning of the last century with very prominent figures. Einstein was shown here, and others who have been something also like public heroes because they were doing things for the society and where the evidence, what can be important, where this was completely clear to everybody, although most of them didn't understand it, but there was something like an authority by these type of heroic scientists. Now we have completely different public figures like Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or people like this where people trust what they say and admire them because they produce something and they shape reality by their own modes. And this is, of course, not a scientific mode, but something like engineering and economics. So these are aspects, I think, that have to be taken into respect when we think about the changing role of society within, of science within modern societies. Then I wanted to also ask a reverse question. The topic of this conference is Wissenschaft braucht Gesellschaft. But the interesting question would also be, what can Wissenschaft do for Gesellschaft? Yeah, so like the Kennedy question, don't ask what society can do for science, but ask what science can do for society. Because I think this is a really important question exactly in the moment where our conventional political patterns come into a kind of movement and be threatened. So because the conditions of what we can do on conferences like this, in our universities, in our research projects, etc., is based on the form of society and state that we have, that provides the framework for free universities, for free research, for free gathering of knowledge. And I think this is a really important point in the moment when we see in real existing societies in Europe, in Northern America, in Turkey, and wherever, that exactly this framework for our work, for the possibilities of what we can do, of what scientists can do, what researchers can do, is threatened or taken away. And I think this is something which is not trivial as an aspect, because we know from the history of the 20th century how fast this devaluation of scientific knowledge and so becomes something like a societal standard. Think of National Socialism, think about other things. And then there is another point exactly related to this. If you read authors from the 1930s, like Stefan Zweig or Sebastian Haffner or Victor Klemperer, the diaries of Victor Klemperer, what was the greatest surprise of these people, observation, the transformation of the society they were living in as intellectuals, as scientists, as researchers? The greatest surprise was that it was their peers that changed sides. Victor Klemperer's diaries are really impressive because he was so surprised and so desperate that the people he educated were the first one to change sides and be opposite to Jewish academics and so, and did everything to throw these colleagues out of the universities, out of the academia, and they were very successful with it. There's a quote by Victor Klemperer, I think from 1941, where he's reasoning about what will happen with all these peoples after the fall of National Socialism, and I have to quote this in German because it's very impressive. Also denkt darüber nach, was wird wohl dann mal sein, wenn diese Zeit mal vorbei ist und ein anderes Regime wiederkommt. Was will man denn mit den ganzen Leuten machen? Und dann denkt er ein bisschen nach und sagt, naja, all diese kleinen Parteigenossen, Arbeiter und so, die muss man laufen lassen. Die können ja nichts dafür. Aber die Kollegen aus der Universität, aus allen deutschen Universitäten, die muss man alle an die Laterne hängen und so lange hängen lassen, wie es die Hygiene irgend zulässt. So this is the desperation that he experienced, because the experience was, and this was exactly with Stefan Zweig and others, that these colleagues and their work and all what enlightenment is standing for was absolutely of no worth and no value in the moment when it came to a societal transformation at large. So this is something I think one has to have in mind, and this would something where I would say it is really important to think about the responsibility of academics in a transformative society. And this is, of course, not closely related to the content of their work, but closely related to their role as citizens who profit from this type of society the most, more than almost any other professional group in this society. And maybe another small aspect that was impressive to me, we did a few years ago research on helpers and rescuers in the era of National Socialism, so about people who would hide people, Jewish people, or bring them out of the country and things like that. A research project funded by the VolkswagenStiftung. But one of the very interesting aspects in this research was who was the most prominent group of helpers and rescuers? Have it been university professors? Have it been leading scientists, academics, and so? No. Prostitutes, criminals, people from the margins of society. And this is a very interesting thing, because you can learn that people who are on the margin of society are, of course, less likely to identify with the regime or the state or the police or whatever, and have an experience how to handle situations where they themselves are threatened or persecuted. So this is also something really interesting, because we have such a high meaning of ourselves, because we have this formal high education and have this prominent role in society. But I think it's a very, very critical point. How do these privileged people like us behave under changing conditions? And I think it's important to have this in mind in the context of this interrelationship between science and society. And I think the crucial point is really to be aware that there's a great responsibility even in this, or especially in this situation of political transformation. Thank you very much.
It is a pleasure and honor to be talking here today. Thank you. So there's a sentence I've been hearing a lot lately. The universities need to open up. In fact, it's something I've been saying and writing myself more than once. What do we mean by this? We urge chancellors, professors, postdocs, students even, not to close themselves up to the public discourse. We call upon them, be visible, put your knowledge out there, write books that hit the shopping mall, be on TV, use social media, learn to use a language more simple, advocate your values, and so forth. Don't be the ivory tower. There is a promise behind these imperatives. If the university is open, everybody can get in. The promise is, if people can see what's going on inside, they will trust and understand the facts and the truth being produced by experts. I think that indeed with every scholar hiding from the public and every university raising its walls, the scientific community becomes weaker. Yet I also think there's something really great about the ivory tower. It's shiny and bright and can be seen from afar. It gives orientation if you get lost. I consider it extremely important for science and humanities to be seen, even to be looked up to, for their knowledge, their methods, their intellectual strength, and their values. So, before one throws open all doors, one should make sure it's not too messy inside. As a journalist writing about higher education, science, and humanities, I'm a frequent visitor of academic spaces. And I'd like to point out 3 of those spaces, so to say, that, from my point of view, are not in such a good shape or do need, in fact, a whole new design. If science and humanities want to take responsibility for our society, as the topic of this section suggests, die Verantwortung der Wissenschaft, they need to take responsibility for themselves to begin with. First, no history of science. Do universities know where they're coming from? Do the institutions of higher education cultivate and maintain their own historical memory? How intensely does today's research reflect its own past, the epistemological shifts it produces and is framed by itself? Having just listened to Naomi Oreskes, it's actually quite easy to make a point for the importance of this field, the history of science. It is crucial for anyone belonging to a university, be they students or professors or chancellors, to learn that and how the production of knowledge is deeply intertwined with the political, economical, cultural, geographical, even religious state a society is in. Our knowledge has changed, it will continue to do so, and the scholars in this field of science history keep track. They are experts in explaining to society the amazing benefits science has brought to all of us, and why at the same time there is no such thing as an ultimate fact, never to be taken into consideration again. The humanities in general are the ones who help us understand who we are and how we got here. Unfortunately, there's hardly any history of science being taught in Germany. In fact, the field is shrinking. In 1997, there were 28 professorships in this field. In 2015, only 17.5 were left. There are 426 universities in Germany. Only 15 offer positions in science history. I should mention the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, which is doing great work. The field, though, is officially listed as a small subject, kleines Fach. In other words, it is endangered or at the risk of extinction. Being a small subject is no fate. I wonder, are members of the universities okay with their very own history being this underestimated? Second, rocket science. We all just heard it, facts don't speak for themselves. They need to be explained by somebody who is this somebody. From my experience, scholars are eager to talk about their research. They know a lot of stuff about whatever topic is filling the newspaper and Twitter feed every day. They could explain the world. However, they are not trained to talk to the public. If you've been locked up in a lab 3 years, or if you spent the last 5 years in an archive, it really is not that easy to explain your insights to a journalist in 2 minutes. It takes confidence to speak live on the radio or TV. It takes practice to do so in short, precise sentences. It takes effort to write an essay for the newspaper that does not sound like a scientific paper. It takes experience to know journalists one trusts. And being a science communicator takes time. Professors don't have time. They have a million things to do, and being a promoter of their scientific field is not their priority, which is okay. That means somebody else has to do the job or help the scholar do it herself. That's where the university management gets in. Do they give the topic as much attention and money as it needs? For once, they're much stronger needed to support their media and communications team, financially and symbolically. The transfer of academic knowledge into media and society is a top-notch job one should hire top-notch people for. From my observation, a lot is happening in this field these days. Also, scholars seem to worry less and less that speaking out publicly may undermine their credibility. Second, as I have just said, most scientists are not trained to talk to the media or, and this is just as important, to politicians and people in public policy. Why not make this an integral part of higher education? Talking about research in an interesting, trustworthy way is no rocket science. It can be taught and learned in seminars. One thing is crucial, though. The time and effort a scholar invests in communicating with the media, the public, and policymakers needs to be taken serious as actual work. It belongs on the CV, and this CV needs to be appreciated by whoever is hiring the scholar. Third, is it a man's world? The March for Science was great. Why? It showed that scholars are not to be trifled with. They decided to strike back and take responsibility for their work and their values. Human rights, democracy, equality, internationalization, fearlessness of the other. I couldn't help but get the feeling, though, that the academic world in this movement was portrayed as being quite a little greater than it actually is in everyday life. Academia can be undemocratic and unjust and feeding on its own privileges. Think of the many teaching positions, especially held by young people, who are not paid well. Or one could talk about the social segregation in academia. There are still much less students, postdocs, professors, let alone say chancellors, who have a working class or migration background. Or one could talk about the number of women who, in Germany, hold full professorships, 23%, or women who are leading a university, 18%, or women who are the director of an Academy of Sciences, 0%. Homogeneity is a problem for academia. The subject we're discussing at this conference, and Naomi Oreskes has pointed this out in her work, is not only about facts and how to convey them. If universities are facing a hostile environment, if society does not trust research, then we're talking about nothing less than a colliding set of values. So, how does one deprive the merchants of doubt of their capital? By changing the framework of their discourse and by addressing what really is at stake. Not only articulating, but actually pursuing academic values, I think, is a way of getting there. Might something so simple as hiring and supporting more female scholars not be a way to do so? Yes, it's part of what needs to be done. Universities should be a model for society. They should show what is possible and how to make it work. They should be diverse and fair and inclusive and self-reflexive and not be afraid of the questions that need to be answered or which they don't have answers for yet. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we will have a bit of time to discuss with you later on. Please let me begin with not with disagreement, but with agreement. My impression is that you all say it was a mistake to get rid of, let's call it philosophy, in the university context, because that led to a spread of false ideas about what science really is. So if I got you all correctly, you agree in saying it would be necessary to have that much deeper implemented in all of the areas of science at the universities. That would help to communicate. Is that right? So that's a good point. I mean, we start with an agreement on that point. The second, well, we could ask, of course, now, why did we get rid of that? Maybe it had to do with what you mentioned, rocket science. It's not very sexy. It doesn't have a great payoff to do history of science. You know, it's like an addendum to what you do as a real scientist. Second thing I observed is you all talked about processes of transformation in which we are in. Professor Oreskes, you mentioned that it might be very difficult to have an agreement in a crisis where it's exactly at stake which view is right and which view is wrong. Harald and you mentioned that it's very difficult to know where you're at in this process of transformation. So how do you think, if we are in a process like that, and I think we are, we could increase the trust in science in a process of transformation? Because science itself, as you said, is not a help. Because science itself is divided into different views of what is true and what is false. So how could we, in a situation like that, how could we increase the trust of people in science?
Maybe just an attempt. I think especially in processes of societal transformation, there's a lot of knowledge and concepts to explain these processes of transformation. I mean, by historians, by sociologists, by whomever who has some kind of competence in understanding those kinds of processes, but it is not, es gilt als nicht sehr fein to make this kind of analysis of contemporary processes, especially in these disciplines. So everybody is completely, they are afraid to make too many comments on these things because maybe this is not totally data-based and maybe it's too speculative, whatever, and colleagues wouldn't like it and things like that. But isn't it the role, speaking of disciplines that I have to do something with, to exactly use this type of knowledge to comment on what is going on? So therefore I think, and this might be also contribute to something like the image of science, that these are not only people who get a lot of money from the state and do research in their beautiful laboratories and things like that, but have also something like a public position because of the responsibility they claim for themselves. So maybe this is also a mode to regather something of this kind of acknowledgement.
I would like, it's just to add something really. You were talking about the crowd intelligence, and I think that's true. But I also think it's important to have scholars who are very widely known to the public, because I think it can be really inspiring to know their story and their history of research. How did they get into the institution? How was their work? How did they deal with their curiosity? So these are stories that can be inspiring, especially for children. So I imagine it would be good if every kid in school knows, you know, one or two or even more big scholars, maybe in the country or worldwide. Stephen Hawking probably is a good example. So that it gets more flash to it, right? In a very literal way. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things in what you said. I guess I would just add a couple of things. So I didn't mean to imply that scientists disagree about everything all the time. There are major areas in which scientists do come to agreement and consensus on, and that's actually quite remarkable and significant, that given how prone to arguing scientists are, the fact that they could agree is telling us something important. So I think it's very important for us to be clear about areas of agreement. For example, in climate science, that there's essentially no argument among scientists that climate change is underway, it's caused by people, and it's not a good thing. But that said, one of the things that's disturbed me in the last couple of years is, in defense of science, many people who are not highly educated in history and philosophy of science, which often includes scientists, but sometimes people who are trying to support science, but I think they do it in an unhelpful way, will invoke a model of science that we know is wrong, or that we know is untrue, or they hold scientists up to be some kind of heroes, which, as you said, if you open the door and you find it's a lot different, then that can be disillusioning. And I think some of the public disillusionment with science has to do with that. It's once you set people up to be gods, then in a way you're asking for the gods to fall. So I think we've seen a bit of that happen. But also, you know, I've heard people sort of invoking popper or falsification to say, oh, well, we know science is true because it's falsifiable. And then it's like, you know, it's like you just wish that they had taken some, you know, serious philosophy of science, and they would know that that kind of a defense of science won't hold up to any kind of serious scrutiny. So part of my work is to think about how can we defend what's good about science and the reasons, the epistemic reasons for saying that we do have a good basis to believe that climate change is a real threat without invoking an artificial view of science or an artificial view of scientists as some kind of hero that really can't stand up to scrutiny.
Isn't one of the reasons why there is a lot of distrust in society in general that interest groups, lobby groups, politicians took certain studies as argument or even empirical data proving that their point of view was right? One of the best examples is climate change and Exxon and the oil companies, which falsified data, and the tobacco industry, which also falsified data on whether or not smoking is dangerous to your health. So there is a general distrust because findings of scientists could be arbitrarily used to support your own point of view.
Right. Well, that was why when Eric Conway and I discovered the materials that became the book, Merchants of Doubt, we thought it was an important story to tell, because the point of that was these things had been constructed as scientific debates, but they really weren't. Right. And we thought that was important because one of the things I think is, I mean, there aren't too many things that are universal that you could say is generally true about all people in different countries. But I do think that it's generally true that people do not like to be lied to. People do not like to feel that they've been made fools of. And so when we were able to show, you've been lied to, this is a con job, that for many people was an eye-opener. And I've given public talks where people have said to me, oh, before this I was kind of skeptical about climate science, but now I see, now I get it. So I think, you know, this kind of work where you can differentiate between, you know, what is real science and what is disinformation, it's hard work to do. It takes, you know, it takes a certain degree of subtlety because it's not always obvious initially, but I do think it's important.
Yeah, but this is of course true, but we have to think about the arenas where scientific results are communicated. If you think about the famous talk shows, for example, on German television, but all over the world, the basic mode of designing a talk show is to have people with different opinions so that there is kind of conflict in the conversation. And if you take exactly the example of climate change, last week there was at Maischberger John Schellenhuber discussing with one climate skeptical in Germany. So people in Germany are totally convinced that there is anthropogenic climate change and whatever. But in this talk show, there comes a guy like this and has the opportunity to present his weird things. But this is not the real problem. The problem is that the whole conversation is designed by this, because then John Schellenhuber has to start at the beginning and has the same position as this other one. And this is the problem what I mentioned with a competition of different types of media which make different types of information. And for the ordinary receiver of this type of conversation, everything seems to be the same because they don't know how this knowledge comes into place and things like that. So, and I think the responsibility of media is really important, and there's something which is not very good that is going on, because everything is designed for making all kinds of conflict and things like that, because the idea is that this is what people are interested in. So, and it's not the content alone, it's the form which is problematic, I think.
Scientists sometimes ask me what one could do against TV shows like this. So they sit at home, they're so angry, they don't know what to do because, you know, it's on the TV, they cannot say something immediately. So I think what you can do is you can write to the TV or media outlet, whoever it is, or to the newspaper if you read something that is wrong in your opinion or was really misleading the public, I think you should, scientists and scholars can write. I think this could make a difference if the journalists, realize this was maybe not a good idea.
But if I could just add to that, I mean, I totally agree with you about that. And I often say to scientists, don't just scream at the television, right? Which a lot of us have been doing a lot in the last year in the United States. But the problem isn't just that something is said that's wrong. The problem is the entire framing, right? And this is something that I think the journalistic community has to take on board, that the model of objectivity as being opposing sides is a fundamentally flawed model. And we know from our work that industry exploits that. So, for example, one of the things the tobacco industry did for decades was to reach out to journalists, lobby journalists, and say, well, we would like to present our side, and we would like you to present, quote, both sides of this issue. And for decades in the United States, journalists, and not just bad journalists, but respected newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and respected television programs, all went along with this because it fit their own model of what they thought journalistic objectivity was. So that tells me that we need a bigger conversation also about what do we mean by objectivity, because the idea that objectivity just means you give equal time to opposing views is clearly not just erroneous, but it's damaging, really, really damaging. And just to give one example, from our own work, to make journalists understand, I'm not just, like sometimes journalists get upset when I say this because they think I'm bashing them, but when we were doing the work, we came across evidence that Edward R. Murrow, the great American broadcaster, had in fact succumbed to this and had done a television show in the early 1960s, so long after there was substantial evidence for the harms of tobacco, giving, quote, equal time to both sides. And when I came across this in the archives, I was like, no, not Edward R. Murrow, the greatest journalist in the history of American journalism. So even he fell for it. So it means journalists have to become more educated themselves about the tactics that are used to manipulate the journalistic framework.
Would you say then that it would help if all the universities, say in Germany, and the main scientific interest groups like Max Planck, Fraunhofer, Leibniz, whatever, would join and make a memorandum addressing very precisely to the journalistic audience, TV, newspaper, even internet, certain standards of what you should and should not do if you communicate science? Would you say that helps?
Well, I don't know. What do you think? You're the journalist.
I think a memorandum is always good. Doesn't hurt.
Worth a
well,
try.
It should hurt, I think.
But I really think it's also good to, to put it into action. So if you see a TV, discussion, and you think it really hurt our standards, then somebody important from that institution, university or Max Planck, whoever, should call and, say this was not okay. It hurt our scientific standards.
I mean, we shouldn't be too naive and have the interpretation that it's something like, misunderstanding on the side of the journalists or so. These are business cases, especially the talk shows. So they are designed exactly in this mode because they think this attracts people. So, and there's another thing that is related to this. What is the role of the Wissenschaftszeitungen in print magazines and newspapers compared, for example, for the traveling section? So, speaking about climate change, it's quite interesting that you have a small report on the latest scientific data, and then you turn the pages, and then you have 10 pages on cruise ship traveling and things like that. And it's absolutely great and beautiful. So this is what I mean. It's not only about content, it's also about the form, which is the broad framework, how these things are communicated. And this makes the difference, I think.
But I think this is a very, very big challenge, because one of the things I've looked at is, how was science presented back in the 1950s compared to how it is today? And I think one of the big challenges we face is that much of the information that's coming out of the scientific community right now is bad news. Climate change is a bad news story. The risks of glyphosate pesticides is a bad news story. And a lot of people don't want to hear bad news. And that really contrasts with, say, if you go back to the 1950s, where a lot of the science stories in journalism were, stories about inventions, modernity, progress, Walt Disney, the space program, we're going to go to the moon, all these sort of glorious, heroic stories. And so science was associated with technological progress. Now science is often associated with kind of putting the brakes on technological progress, saying, well, yeah, we thought fossil fuels were good. Now we realize there's this really dark underbelly to the fossil fuel economy. So this is a much harder story to tell. And I think it's part of the problems that universities have too, because I agree with what you said, that universities should take these issues much more seriously. I mean, you've seen this, right? You talked about this, that scientists don't consider communication their real work, but they should. It is real work. It's hard. It's challenging. It takes skills. It takes practice, as you said. But a lot of university communications offices, the press releases are really hype. They're hyping the latest discovery, the latest finding. Often they're junk, and I've seen this in my own institution, and it's pretty upsetting as a person who's trying to be serious about what do we really know from science, what can science tell us, what are some of the political and economic questions that go beyond science that scientists are not able to answer. And then your university puts out some press release saying that, this new technology will solve all our problems, whatever it is. I mean, I don't want to use any specific example, but you know what I'm talking about. And so that's not helpful.
I saw some arms raised. There was one question here. Okay.
I'm Rainer Korpmann. I'm blogger on science communication. I feel, with this discussion, I feel 20 years younger. Because this discussion we could have had for 20 years ago. No mention of the changes in media, especially internet media, social media, which are completely different from all you said here. There are no journalists anymore. There are no gatekeepers anymore. No gatekeepers for the truth and for the skeptics either. And no mention of the changes in science. Science has become a field that is tremendously, there is a tremendous competition. Science has organized completely different today than it has been 20 years ago. So that leaking, there is no one science result. Look at gene editing, which was here 2 weeks ago. There is still a patent struggle on who invented it. So science is not one block anymore, and the media are not organized as they were 20 years ago.
That we didn't talk about it is probably due to the fact that you will talk about that precisely tomorrow. So we didn't want to get into that too much, but I think you're right. Any comments? No? Okay, next question, please.
Yeah, Albert Neven, thank you very much for this interesting debate. I'm wondering whether we need in science, given all these challenges that United described, something like a science label. Think about something like a German kind of car control where the cars are still allowed to go on the road. We have that. Do we need something for that? Because given all the diversity of science and complexity of science that we still need, and of course it's intrinsic of science, there's a development that there are really bad journals without any control. They look very scientific. There are bad conferences without any control. They look very scientific. And all that makes an impression on society which is just a drawback to what is real science, so they are not having any standards, and isn't that a development that also has to be accounted for?
This would be the usual solution to invent a new institution, to have new standards and things like that. I think it would be much better to turn it the other way around. who are the ones who do not meet the standards? Who are the ones who do something with the standards? Maybe it's those people out of the scientific scene who would go to the talk shows because it's highly attractive to be there, and also they know that it will not be for good ending that they are there. It's highly attractive for them to be there. The other thing is lobbyism and things that have already been mentioned. So I think it's always a bit misleading to have the first gaze to the outside, but why don't we think about the inside? Because everybody here has something to do with the academia and things like that. So the challenge is directly to us. What kind of work can we do? What kind of work can we be responsible with, and things like that? I think it doesn't make sense to have a TÜV for universities. I think we have enough with excellence universities and things like that. So no TÜV for that. This is never a solution.
Yeah, I think this is a really difficult question, because I think in a free society we don't want to be in a position of saying some group of people are not permitted to have a conference. I mean, I don't think we want that. But at the same time, we know that the exploitation of what you said, things that are made to look like science, camouflage like science. I wrote a paper recently in the Philosophy of Science journal, Synthèse, on what I call facsimile sciences, specifically about this issue. So the question really is, how do we judge this work, and how do we compare it without trying to shut it down? And I think this gets back to what you were saying earlier about journalists and education. Sometimes the solutions are actually not that difficult. So I've had journalists say to me, when I've criticized journalists, you know, for having some charlatan on television debating a credible climate scientist, you know, this journalists will say, well, what am I supposed to do? And I said, well, one thing you could do is you could ask this person, do they have training in this field? Do they have a PhD in climate science? I mean, the answer in most cases to that question is no. So with a single question, you could find out that this person is really a charlatan. Second question, what have you published recently in a peer-reviewed journal on this? That would get rid of all the rest of them. So, you know, two simple questions would help journalists right from the get-go. Now, if they're doing it deliberately, or if they're being deliberately pressured by their editors or their producers, then it's more tricky. But then you can begin to say, but look, there are 100 real issues we could fight about climate change. There's plenty of real stuff to fight about. You know, all the policy choices, adaptation, mitigation, how quickly do we do this? What are we going to do about Donald Trump? What's going to happen to Paris? I mean, there's so many real issues that are real conflicts that we could fight about. Let's have those fights, but not a fake fight about whether or not climate change is real.
Hannes Schlender from Science Relations. Harald Welzer, you mentioned that we shouldn't be naive and should accept that it's a business model of talk shows like that from Maischberger to bring together scientists and skeptics for climate change, for example, on one level. Full stop. I fully agree. But what is the consequence resulting out of this?
I think one consequence is that what we have in Germany, which is called öffentlich-rechtlicher Rundfunk, should not work in a way like they do in the moment. And we have to keep in mind that these are privately produced formats that are bought by the öffentlich-rechtliche Rundfunk. So there are many, many other formats which might be much more interesting also for the audience, which have a complete different design. But everybody would say, oh, this is not what the people want to see, because this is only a conversation, this is no fight, and So all these programs are full with these Streitgespräche, with the assumption that people are interested in Streitgespräche. Maybe this is wrong, but I think the organizational crucial point is that these are privately produced formats, and that they appear not in private television, but in öffentlich-rechtlichem Fernsehen, which is a problem in itself. So it's a political issue. I think like everything that we are talking about here are political issues, and we have to take it seriously, especially in the situations that are coming up even on our very good and safe societies. I think this is at the heart of this conference. to my understanding.
Maybe just a brief comment. Deliberately started with our agreement. Because disagreement, as Harald just said, is what you find in television all over the place. And the reason why people like disagreement is because it comes from the entertainment industry. If two people battle each other, you know, it can be funny, entertaining, whatever. But that's not the right form, as Harald put it, for science. And the second thing is, yes, there are gatekeepers. You don't have the gatekeepers in the internet, as you just mentioned. But you need political support, and you need support of scientists, because if the AfD, for example, now wants to get rid of public television because it's, you know, state, whatever, state-induced form of brainwashing, then it gets more difficult. And a lot of politicians said, well, television is only worth the money if you have enough people watching it. Well, if that's your main guideline, well, then we all have what we have on TV right now.
But I think if I could just say one more thing, this gets back to the question of the ivory tower and also about what foundations should be funding or what universities should be doing. So it is true there are some people on television or in the media who will do the fight, the conflict thing, no matter what. But I also think there are many people in the media who are trying to do the right thing, but often don't know what the right thing is. So if we go back to Edward R. Murrow, you know, he was considered a highly credible journalist, or the New York Times. One of the things we saw in the archive was the tobacco industry spent a lot of time and money visiting editors. We found a letter in the archives where tobacco industry executive writes to Arthur Oakes Sulzberger at the New York Times and says, we'd like to come and visit you and chat with you and present our view. And the New York Times editor says, of course, we welcome, you know, a conversation with you. But there's no parallel letter from the Surgeon General or from the head of the National Institutes of Health or from the president of Harvard University. The academics, the scientists, are all assuming that the facts are going to speak for themselves, that they just have to do the science and it'll all be fine. But the tobacco industry knows that if the facts are against them, they have to fight those facts and they have to spend time and money and energy. So it's a completely unlevel playing field. And so that, to me, is an important finding, because it's telling us that at least in, I mean, I'm sure the New York Times didn't mean to become a sucker of the tobacco industry, and I've actually talked to people at the New York Times about this now. I mean, it's actually quite embarrassing for them. I mean, I don't know if anyone here saw the op-ed piece I did in the Times, but when our big paper on ExxonMobil came out in August, we did an op-ed piece in the New York Times to go with it. And one of the things that came out in our work was that the New York Times had run all these advertisements from ExxonMobil that were essentially fraudulent. I mean, they were presenting lies as if they were facts and presenting it in the format of an editorial that was not even labeled an advertisement. And the people at the New York Times, the editors that I worked with, they were actually very nervous about this. And they got, at the very last minute, when our editorial was supposed to go to press, I got a call from the editor I was working with saying that his boss was worried that people would take my op-ed piece as an attack on the New York Times because we were pointing out that they had published these fraudulent advertisements. And that was not the purpose of the piece. But when the editor said to me, well, people might ask the question, why did the New York Times publish these advertisements? I said, well, that would be a good question to ask. I mean, that would be a totally legitimate question to ask, you know? And they made me put in this little, like, link to the New York Times advertising policy, which basically said, as long as what you were saying wasn't, like, racist or hate speech or, like, Nazi, you could pretty much say anything you want in an advertisement. So, you know, that is something that does require interrogation. And that's not just a business model about selling conflict. That's some other kind of weird notion of objectivity that I think desperately needs to be interrogated.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. Last question, I'm afraid. Oh, okay, we have one more then.
Volker Meyer-Guckel from the Stiftung, and I would like to take up the word of the arena that Harald Welzer was mentioning. If we have a look at the scientific disciplines that are under attack right now by these authoritarian leaders, we have the climate change things, we have gender studies, we have maybe genetics. We don't have mathematics or medieval history or linguistics. Nobody doubts objectivity in that realms of science. But it's these realms of science which have decided to change into the political realm, to change their mode of scientific work from analytics, a descriptive mode, to a normative mode. The climate change disciplines not only tell us what is wrong with climate change, but how we have to shape our lives. And so do people who say that genetically modified crops will be a good possibility to change our life. And so do people who do gender studies, that we have to change our way we are organized in society. That is to say, we come into a normative realm where it's not about objectivity, but about the distribution of wealth, power, and resources. And that's the political realm. And that's where you get the political discourse. And suddenly you're in a political discourse, which is, you know, hit 'em hard. Because it's about power and resources and distribution of wealth. So I think we're not really talking about a threat of science, but a move of science into an arena where other models, formats, of discourse are being used. You call it business models in the media, and then there's the political model in the political realm. So isn't that the thing we have to discuss?
Well, if I may respond to that, because this is what I've worked on for the last 10 years. So there's a kernel of truth in what you said. There's no question that one of the reasons why climate science has become so contested is because it's perceived to have very profound political, economic, and social implications. And that's true. However, it's not true, as you implied, that this is why climate science got attacked. And I think this is an extremely important thing to understand, because I think it's been misunderstood by many people, including many climate scientists. The attacks on climate science way predate any climate scientist being vocal about the policies or the social change. So we have many scientists in America. Ben Santer is my favorite example because I know him well, but Mike Mann, Jim Hansen, many of these others, all they did was science. All they did was publish factual, quantitative evidence in peer-reviewed journals about historic temperature records or about the warming of the troposphere. I mean, Ben Santer did the key analysis that showed that climate change could not be explained by solar variation because of the warming of the troposphere while the stratosphere was cooling, and I can explain that in more detail if people are interested. He never said a word about any policy, about any implications. He never recommended any policy, and he became the target of a vicious, slanderous attack in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. And this is the pattern we have seen over and over again. Now, sometimes when this happens, scientists do become political. So Jim Hansen, for example, has had this incredible personal narrative trajectory of having been a very conservative Republican from Iowa, you know, farm boy from rural America, who has now become a radical who's getting arrested in front of the White House. He became a radical because his science was attacked and because the epistemic model that he was working on, I do the facts speak for themselves, I just hand over the facts to the political authorities and they decide what to do about it. That was his model. That was the model of an entire generation of scientists, myself included. We thought that if we did good science, we handed over to policymakers, policymakers would make sensible decisions. And what the scientific community found was not only did policymakers not necessarily make sensible decisions, but they became attacked simply for presenting facts that had certain kinds of political consequences that some powerful people and organizations didn't like. And that is absolutely crucial to understand.
Thank you. I would also like to comment on the gender studies, since you mentioned that. The attacks on gender studies made this field appear political because they made it appear as political. But many of the things I read about gender studies, and this is a field I know something about, they was not informed very well about the research that has been done. So it has turned into a political field, even though gender studies themselves weren't so political to begin with. So this is something I don't want to blame the media, but I have read many articles on gender studies that were really not well informed and were actually hurting this field badly. So we have to see what was first here.
I also wanted to comment on this comment, because I think it is not true that it depends on the subject what is attacked and what is not. I might think of medieval history and think of totalitarian politicians. The first thing that what they do is memory politics, and this is of course at the heart of the work of historians and reinventing histories that fit to the concept of their type of state that they want to have. And I think the crucial thing is what Naomi just said. These are attacks. And I think we, as part of the scientific community, have to take it serious, these attacks. These are no problems of people don't understand it right in this political field. This is not something where people have not enough information. This is an attack on enlightenment. I want to be that pathetic because what we do, but what we do and all the origins of this type of science we do and research we do is based on the values of enlightenment. And these attacks have nothing to do with it. This is Gegenaufklärung. So I think a very political thing is to take these attacks seriously and not as mistakes or failures or naivety or they didn't get it right. I think this is really important for what is going on in the moment, because this is also something which is something I have to say as a social psychologist. It's also misleading to think that right-wing people didn't understand the facts right. They want to do something with this type of society, and they want to do something with this type of academic system and school system. And this is not a question of correcting their misleading visions. This is something like a political Auseinandersetzung, something where we have to be really aware what is going on and who is attacked. So
yeah, and if I could just add one more thing without beating this to death, since we are in Germany and we are talking about authoritarian and totalitarian forms of governance, there were forms of mathematics that were attacked here in the 1930s as Jewish mathematics. So anyone who thinks that a field can be immune from political attacks if it's sufficiently pure, that's just not supported by history.